I'm Caroline Wyatt. I am a BBC journalist and I have been BBC defence correspondent, Paris correspondent, Germany correspondent, and Moscow correspondent, so people might know me from that. Like many people, I had suspicions that there was something very wrong from a much earlier stage. So, long before the actual diagnosis, I think in 1992, when I had burning and numbness in my arms, I was told that that was RSI, repetitive strain injury. But it continued, and I had other odd symptoms for a long time. In 2001, I was told that I had clinically isolated syndrome. I was sent for a brain scan after I fell over. And I didn't know really at the time what that meant. I was told it could become MS, but wouldn't necessarily. And then by 2015, I was starting to get really quite ill. I was very, very tired all of the time, never felt as though I'd slept, was getting increasing pain in the arms, I was getting a lot of migraines, and finally went to see the neurologist again, who said, after a lot of tests, that it was definitively MS. So in a lot of ways, it was a relief to get the diagnosis, because you do start to think you're going mad, because the symptoms come and they go, and as a lot of people do, I went to see a lot of different doctors, and they were all convinced that it was something to do with their speciality. And it really wasn't until I was told definitively this is MS that I felt able to kind of look back and say, well, this was how it progressed over time. For me, the main symptom that I've always had has been the fatigue. So I could never understand why I was so exhausted all of the time. And even if I hadn't done anything particularly exhausting, I would wake up in the morning feeling as though I had run a marathon. So everything was hurting and stiff and aching. And now, as the MS has progressed, the pain has got worse, and things like migraines, headaches, that's got worse. Optic neuritis is another one where I must have been to see 4 or 5 different eye specialists before I had the diagnosis, who all said, oh, there's nothing wrong with your eyes. And what I didn't realise was that I should have seen a neuro-ophthalmologist. But the regular eye doctors didn't pick it up, and it was only once I had the diagnosis that it kind of clicked, oh, this is optic neuritis. So I sometimes get a blurring in one eye in particular, but there's pain in both eyes. So, and there's not an awful lot you can do about quite a few of the symptoms. You know, you can take drugs to relieve some, but I found that, for example, the nerve pain drugs make me so foggy and so unable to think that I couldn't work and take the drugs at the same time, and I personally would rather work and put up with the pain. I have become much less of a planner. I used to have my entire calendar planned out and cram the days with as many things as I possibly could. Partially, I think, because of a sense that time might be running out to be able to do all the things I wanted to do in terms of travel and work. And I am much better these days, because I have to be, about planning in breaks, not putting too much in the diary, only having, I don't know, one meeting a day, and being prepared to cancel things if I don't feel up to it, which I was very reluctant to do in the past. So I think some of that is down to acceptance, that you do have to accept you can do less. But equally, I think I've probably become slightly more bullshy about saying to people, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do. I always wanted to continue to work, so even when it got quite difficult, I just felt that for me, A, it really helps to pay the mortgage, but B, work was and remains a really important part of my identity. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of people. And I have been very, very lucky to work for the BBC, which is a big employer, so it employs about 20,000 people, which means that in terms of making adjustments, even before I had the diagnosis of MS, I was able to go and talk to my bosses and say, you know, these are the things I can do, these are the things I can't do. And that's changed over time, and they've been very, very good at responding to that. I think it's only now that I am going into secondary progressive MS that it's becoming harder to explain. And I think MS is a very difficult disease to explain to employers, because one day you might be able to do something, but the next day you can't. So some days I can still walk down to the tube, but there are other days where I get down to the bottom of my stairs and I can't get as far as the tube. Like many people, I saw the BBC Panorama programme done by my colleague Fergus Walsh and thought, that looks interesting. I had already taken 2 MS drugs that hadn't actually helped, and I was getting to a stage where I was going downhill very fast, and certainly my impression was that I was going from relapsing remitting MS into secondary progressive, partly as a result of age. So your body stops healing itself as fast as it did when you were young. And so I looked into it, did some more research, and decided in the end to go ahead with it. I wasn't accepted here in the UK for the Sheffield trial, for the clinical trial, because I didn't meet all the criteria. In the end, I went abroad, which is not something I would necessarily encourage people to do, because I think it's much more readily available under quite tight criteria here in the UK now. I felt it was worth trying for me, partly because of my age, that one of the issues with it is that you might well lose your fertility, but I'm 50, I was 50 at the time, so that wasn't a problem for me. The treatment itself is chemotherapy. It is a harsh treatment, but then again, so are some of the MS drugs. So it was a difficult decision, because in the end, it meant going abroad, going private. It gave me probably 6 very good months straight after the treatment where my brain fog lifted for the first time in years, which was amazing. But sadly, over the last few months, I have started to progress again. So nearly 2 years on, I'm pretty much back to where I was before the treatment. So I do know people for whom it has halted progression. Equally, I know people who've been worse as a result, and I know of one person who's died. So it is a risky route to take, but I think the more research that goes into it, the better, because it's stem cell transplants and stem cell treatments, I think, will be something in the future that's used much more as a first-line treatment. It was a difficult decision. It was made in conjunction with my family. I talked to my friends. I did go and talk to consultants, and I think that's quite important, to go and talk to your neurologist, but also to a haematologist, because it's a haematological speciality. I, in the end, felt that the risks were worth it for me, but that was an entirely individual decision. And had I had children or dependents, then perhaps I wouldn't have done it, but I don't. So the risk was purely one for me, and I felt at the time that it was worth taking. I think, as with any treatment that is still undergoing trials, where doctors don't necessarily know exactly how it works or why it works for some people really well and not for others at all, I would recommend that people research it, talk to people who've had it, talk to the specialists, read the medical research, because some of it does show that there can be a risk of secondary autoimmune diseases afterwards. No treatment is without some risk, and so for people thinking about it, really, really do your research first. I think I would be really happy if people knew more about MS, understood more about MS, and donated a lot of money to research into it, because the figures may not be large, but the impact that it has on people's lives is enormous. There are so many people who struggle, if they're women, to take care of their children, to have enough energy left to do anything themselves. There are people I've met who've been extremely disabled by it from a very, very young age. And it's still a disease that is a mystery, where they don't really know what's caused it. And although there are many more treatments available now, they don't cure it, they don't take it away. And I think that more research, and in the UK, more MS nurses, for example, would be absolutely brilliant, because they can help so much on a day-to-day level, where you can't ring your consultant. But if you are having a new symptom, or you need advice, or you need help filling out, I don't know, the many forms that can come with the disability, then MS nurses are essentials. I think if you have just been diagnosed with MS, don't panic, because whatever you imagine, it's unlikely to get that bad. I have now had MS for probably 26, 27 years, something like that. And my imaginings earlier on about how bad I would get, how fast, it hasn't got that bad that fast, and it's all been dealable with. And I think you will have to mourn or to grieve the person that you were and the things that you could do and some of the things that you can't achieve, but you can still do an awful lot and you can still achieve an awful lot. And I think the one thing that having MS has done for me is make me examine my priorities. And that hasn't been an entirely negative thing, because it means that you look at your life and you say, well, what's important? Is it my family and my friends? Is it, to a degree, my work? How can I work around these things so that I can do enough with my family but still enjoy the work that I do? So I think it makes you take a really long, hard look at yourself and your life.